The sky above Vareth 4 had not been blue in 11 years, and Sergeant Callum Voss could not remember a time when the horizon held anything other than smoke and fire, and the pale orange glow of orbital bombardment raining down like the anger of gods who had forgotten how to forgive. He dragged himself through the rubble of what had once been a street, though no human had ever walked it before the war came to this world, and the shapes of the broken buildings around him were strange and curved in ways that made his eyes ache, because they had been built by hands that were not human and minds that did not think in straight lines. His left leg was bleeding from a piece of shrapnel that had buried itself just below the knee during the strike that had torn his forward base apart like paper in a hurricane, and every step sent a hot wire of pain shooting up through his thigh and into his spine. But he kept walking because stopping meant dying, and Callum Voss was not ready to die on a planet that did not even have a name worth remembering. The Velthari had called this world something beautiful once, a word that translated roughly to the garden where new songs begin. But the Terran military had stamped a code on it and moved on, because that was what war did to beautiful things. It gave them numbers instead of names. Callum had been a combat medic for 6 of the 11 years this war had been burning across the stars, and in that time, he had learned exactly 2 things that mattered. The first was that every species bled the same shade of desperate when they were afraid, and the second was that no amount of training could prepare a man for the sound of silence after a battle ended, because silence meant everyone who had been screaming was now beyond the reach of screaming. His squad was gone, not dead, he hoped, but scattered after the orbital strike had collapsed the tunnels beneath their position, and his comm unit was a melted lump of plastic and metal fused to the side of his pack like some ugly growth. So he was alone in the ruins of a Velthari hive settlement that Terran forces had destroyed weeks ago, walking through the bones of someone else's home. The Velthari were not small creatures, and the doorways he passed through rose high above his head, carved from a material that looked like stone but felt warm under his fingers, almost alive, and the walls still held traces of bioluminescent patterns that had once glowed with light and meaning, but now flickered weakly like candles in their final moments. He knew he should feel nothing for this place because the Velthari had burned human colonies with the same cold efficiency, had torn through civilian shelters without mercy, had left behind ruins that looked exactly like this one except filled with human toys and human photographs and human bones, and he carried that knowledge in his chest like a stone he could not swallow and could not spit out. But war had taught him something else too, something he never said out loud because it would have made the other soldiers uncomfortable, that destroying someone's nursery felt wrong no matter whose nursery it was. He was thinking about this when he heard the sound. It was small and weak, and it came from beneath a pile of collapsed ceiling material in what his xenobiology training told him was a nursery chamber, and at first he thought it was a wounded animal or perhaps the creaking of damaged structure settling. But then it came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a cry. Not the war shriek of an adult Velthari, that terrible sound like tearing metal that haunted every human soldier's nightmares, but something softer and higher and more fragile, a sound that reached into the oldest part of Callum's brain and pulled at something that existed before language, before species, before the idea of enemies had ever been invented. He stood very still for a long time, and the smart part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 6 years of hell, told him to walk away because whatever was under that rubble was Velthari, and Velthari meant enemy, and enemy meant danger, and danger meant death. But the other part of his mind, the part that had made him become a medic instead of a rifleman, the part that still flinched when he saw suffering even after all these years, that part told him something different. It told him to kneel. So he knelt and he began to dig. The rubble was heavy and sharp, and it cut his hands open as he pulled it aside piece by piece, and his wounded leg screamed at him with every movement. But he kept going because the crying was getting weaker, and weaker meant dying, and he had not become a medic to listen to things die. It took him almost 20 minutes to clear enough debris to see what was beneath it, and when he did, he stopped breathing for a moment. It was a Velthari child. He had never seen one before, no human had, or at least no human who had lived to report it. And it was nothing like what he had expected, because where adult Velthari were towering and armored and terrifying, this creature was small enough to fit in his arms, with soft skin that had not yet hardened into chitin, and enormous dark eyes that reflected the dim light like pools of black water. Its bioluminescent crest, the ridge of tissue that ran from forehead to the back of the skull, and that adult Velthari used for communication and emotional display, was barely developed, just a thin strip of pale tissue that pulsed with a faint, sickly light that his training told him meant dehydration and fear, and the slow approach of death. The child looked up at him, and it made that sound again, that small, broken cry, and Callum felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent 6 years trying to keep sealed shut. He reached down and carefully, so carefully, lifted the child out of the rubble and held it against his chest, and it was lighter than he expected, and warmer, and it trembled in his hands like a leaf in a storm. "It is all right," he whispered, and his voice cracked because he had not spoken gently to anything in a very long time. "I have got you." He pulled his last water ration from his pack, a small pouch that he had been saving because he did not know when he would find more, and he squeezed a few drops onto the child's mouth, and it drank desperately, its small hands gripping his fingers with a strength that surprised him. The child's crest flickered, and the sickly pale light shifted to something slightly warmer, slightly steadier, and Callum told himself that this was just biology, just a medical response to hydration, and that he was not feeling what he was feeling because feeling it would make everything harder. He failed at telling himself this almost immediately. He looked around the destroyed nursery, at the broken walls and the scattered remnants of things that might have been toys or blankets, or whatever the Velthari gave their children to comfort them, and he made a decision that went against every regulation, every protocol, every briefing he had ever received, and every piece of tactical wisdom that had ever been drilled into his skull. He was going to keep this child alive. He fashioned a sling from a torn piece of his uniform jacket and secured the child against his chest, close to his heartbeat, because even across the vast gulf between species, small creatures seemed to find comfort in steady rhythms, and the child pressed itself against him and made a soft chirping sound, a tiny pip-pip-pip that vibrated against his ribs. "Pip," Callum said quietly, testing the word, and the child chirped again as if answering to a name it had just been given. "All right then, Pip, let us get out of here." He stood up slowly, adjusted the weight of the child against his chest, checked the charge on his sidearm, oriented himself toward the distant extraction coordinates that might or might not still be active, and began to walk. Behind him, the ruins of the nursery sat silent in the smoke-filled twilight, and ahead of him lay 40 kilometers of war-torn wasteland filled with enemies on every side, his own people included, because Callum Voss knew with absolute certainty that if any Terran soldier saw what he was carrying, the best outcome he could hope for was a court-martial, and the worst was a bullet. But the child was warm against his chest, and its crest pulsed with a faint blue light that he had not seen before, and something about that blue felt like trust, felt like the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever been given. So he walked, and he did not look back. 3 days into the wasteland, and Callum Voss had learned more about the Velthari than 11 years of military intelligence briefings had ever taught him. And he had learned it all from a creature that weighed less than a house cat and communicated entirely through the colors of a small ridge on its head. Pip's crest was a language unto itself, and Callum had begun to read it the way a sailor reads the sky, not with precision, but with instinct born from necessity and sharpened by the desperate need to keep something alive that depended entirely on him. Soft blue meant calm, and it was the color Pip's crest turned when Callum hummed old songs from Earth, songs his mother had sung to him when he was small, and the world was not yet full of war, and he found it strange and wonderful that melodies written on one world could soothe a child born on another. Flickering orange meant hunger, and when it appeared, Callum would stop and mix a small amount of nutrient paste with water and carefully feed it to Pip from his finger, and the child would eat with the frantic energy of something that had been starving and still remembered the fear of it. Deep violet meant terror, and it came at night when the distant thunder of artillery shook the ground, and the sky lit up with flashes that turned the darkness into a stuttering nightmare of light and shadow. And when the violet came, Callum would hold Pip tighter against his chest and speak in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, about the rain on Earth, about the taste of coffee, about a dog he had once loved, because the words did not matter, only the rhythm of a voice that refused to be afraid. On the second night, something changed. Callum had found shelter in the hollow shell of a destroyed Velthari transport vehicle, its hull cracked open like an egg but still solid enough to block the wind, and he sat with his back against the inner wall and Pip nestled in the crook of his arm, and the child was shivering despite the warmth of his body. Then slowly, so slowly that at first he thought he was imagining it, Pip's skin temperature began to shift, and within minutes the child's body heat had adjusted to match his own exactly, not warmer, not cooler, but precisely the same, as if the child had reached into his biology and synchronized itself with him. He remembered a fragment from a xenobiology briefing years ago, something about Velthari young imprinting on their primary caretaker through thermal bonding, a biological mechanism that told the child's body, "This is safety, this is home, this is the one who will protect me." And the scientist giving the briefing had described it in cold, clinical terms as an evolutionary survival adaptation. But there was nothing cold about the way Pip pressed its small face against his heartbeat and chirped softly and settled into a sleep so deep, and trusting that it made Callum's throat tighten, because this child had not chosen him through logic or species, loyalty, or any of the things that adults used to decide who to trust. It had chosen him because he was warm and his voice was steady, and he had pulled it from the rubble when no one else would. He had not asked to be chosen, but he had been chosen anyway, and that changed something inside him that he could not name and could not undo. By the third day his supplies were nearly gone. His leg wound had begun to show the angry red edges of infection, and he was navigating by the stars because his equipment was destroyed, and he knew that he was moving too slowly and that the extraction window would not stay open forever. He was calculating how many more days he could walk before his body failed him when the voices came through the smoke. Terran voices. He dropped behind a low ridge of rubble and pressed Pip against his chest, and the child's crest flickered violet for a moment before Callum's steady heartbeat calmed it back to blue, and he lay there listening as a four-person recon squad moved through the ruins less than 50 meters from his position. He should have called out to them because they were his people, his species, his side of this war, and they could have given him water and food and medical attention and a ride to extraction. But he looked down at Pip, and he knew what would happen if he walked out there carrying a Velthari child, and so he stayed silent. But Pip did not stay silent. The child let out a small chirp, just one, barely louder than a whisper, but in the dead silence of the wasteland it carried like a shout, and Callum heard the footsteps stop, and then change direction and then grow louder. "Contact, something is over here," a voice said, and then a flashlight beam swept across the rubble and found him, and 4 Terran rifles were suddenly pointed at his face. "Hold your fire," Callum said, raising one hand while the other held Pip against him. "I am Sergeant Callum Voss, 9th Terran Drop Corps, service number 7724 Alpha." The squad leader stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with sergeant stripes and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the ruins around them, and his name tag read KHANE, and his eyes moved from Callum's face to the small alien creature pressed against his chest. And what happened to his expression was not surprise, but something closer to disgust. "What the hell is that?" Sergeant Darius Khan said, and it was not a question. "A child," Callum said. "That is not a child, that is a Velthari," Khan said, and his rifle did not lower. "Do you know what those things did to the colonists on Marin 3? Do you know what they did to children, Voss? Human children." "I know," Callum said, and his voice was quiet, but something in it made one of the other soldiers take a half step back. "I was on the medical team that responded to Marin 3, and I saw everything, and I remember every single thing I saw, and I will remember it until the day I die." "Then why are you holding one of them like it is a baby?" "Because it is a baby." Khan stared at him for a long time, and then he spat on the ground and said, "Put it down and leave it. That is not a request, Sergeant." "No," Callum said. "I outrank you in this situation, Voss." "You do." "Then put the bug down." Callum stood up slowly, and Pip clung to him, and the child's crest was burning violet with fear. And Callum placed his free hand on the child's back and felt it trembling, and he looked at Khan, and at the 3 soldiers behind Khan, all of them armed, all of them capable of ending this in a second. And he said something that he knew was either the bravest or the stupidest thing he had ever said. "You will have to go through me, and I promise you, that will cost more than it is worth." He did not reach for his sidearm, because that would have turned this into a firefight, and Pip would have been the first casualty. But he stood there with the unshakable stillness of a man who had made a decision that went deeper than survival. And something in his eyes must have communicated this, because Khan's trigger finger eased just slightly. "You have lost your mind," Khan said. "Maybe," Callum said, "but I am also the only combat medic in this sector, and your corporal over there is favoring his left side in a way that tells me he has at least 2 broken ribs and possibly a punctured lung. So you can shoot me and lose your medic, or you can let me keep the child and gain one." Khan looked back at his wounded corporal, then at Callum, then at the small alien creature whose crest was slowly shifting from violet back toward blue as Callum's hand moved in slow circles on its back. "This is temporary," Khan said through his teeth. "When we reach command, they will take it from you." "We will cross that bridge when we reach it," Callum said. He treated the corporal's injuries while Pip sat in the sling against his chest and watched with wide dark eyes, and one of the younger soldiers, a private who could not have been older than 19, stared at the child and said nothing, but his face held something that was not anger and not fear, but something more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition, as if the sight of a small helpless creature had reminded him of something he had been trying to forget. They moved out together, 5 humans and 1 alien child, and Khan kept his distance from Callum and did not speak to him, but he did not try to take Pip again. That night, while the squad rested, the young private sat down near Callum and watched Pip sleeping against the medic's chest, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I had a little sister on Marin 3. Callum said nothing for a long moment, then said, "I am sorry." "She was 4, the private said, and his eyes were wet. "They say the Velthari do not understand what children mean to us, that they cannot comprehend it." "They say a lot of things," Callum said. The private looked at Pip, at the small crest glowing soft blue in sleep, and said, "If they do not understand what children mean, then why does that one trust you like you are its whole world?" Callum had no answer to that, or perhaps the answer was so large and so heavy that words were not strong enough to carry it. What none of them knew, not Callum, not Khan, not the young private with the dead sister, was that they were being watched, and that the watchers were not human, and that somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, Velthari eyes were recording everything, and a message was already traveling faster than light toward a matriarch who had been told her children were dead. The message was simple, and it would change the course of a war. The human protects your lastborn as if it were his own. Matriarch Selvin Korath had not moved from her throne in the command chamber of the Hive Carrier Undying Song for 7 cycles, and her advisors had begun to worry in the quiet way that Velthari worried, which was to stand at a distance and let the colors of their crests speak the fear that their mouths would not. She was enormous even by the standards of her kind, 12 feet of living armor and ancient power, her chitin scarred from battles that predated the human war by decades, and her crest, the great sweeping ridge that ran from her brow to the base of her skull, burned with colors that her attendants had never seen a matriarch display, colors that had no name in any language because they belonged to a grief that went beyond words. Her settlement on Varath 4 had been struck by Terran orbital fire 18 days ago, and in the chaos and flame her nursery had been buried, and the scouts who had dug through the wreckage had found the bodies of 6 of her 7 children, each one small and still and cold, their crests dark forever. The 7th child had not been found at all, and in the Velthari understanding of war, a body that could not be recovered was a body that had been vaporized, and a child that had been vaporized was a child that could not be mourned properly, and a child that could not be mourned properly was a wound that would never close. Selvin had accepted this, or she had tried to accept it, because she was a matriarch and matriarchs did not break, and she had channeled her grief into fury and her fury into war, and she had ordered strikes against Terran positions with a cold precision that had made even her own generals uneasy. Then the message arrived. It came from a deep reconnaissance unit she had deployed in the Varath 4 sector, elite shadow warriors whose purpose was to observe and report and never be seen, and the message was 7 words long, and it stopped her heart. The human protects your lastborn as if it were his own. For a long time she did not move, and her advisors watched her crest cycle through colors so rapidly that it looked like fire rippling across water, and then she spoke in a voice that shook the walls of the chamber. "Show me." They showed her the observation recordings, captured from distances that should have made detail impossible but rendered in perfect clarity by Velthari optical technology, and she watched a human, small, wounded, stumbling through the ruins of her destroyed home, pull her 7th child from the rubble of her nursery. She watched him give the child his water, his last water, the observers noted, confirmed by the fact that he did not drink again for nearly a full day after. She watched him fashion a carrying device from his own clothing and hold the child against his chest, close to the rhythmic beating organ that humans used to circulate blood, and she recognized the gesture because it was universal, because every species that had ever loved its young had held them close to the center of their body, where warmth and rhythm lived. She watched him walk for 3 days through a wasteland, injured and starving, and she watched him refuse food from his own soldiers so that the child could eat first, and she watched him stand between armed humans and her child and refuse to move, and his words came through the translator cold and clear. "You will have to go through me." She watched all of this, and then she watched it again, and then a 3rd time, and on the 3rd viewing she noticed something that broke through the armor of her grief and her rage, and her 11 years of hatred for the species that had burned her world. She noticed that the human was singing. It was a soft sound, barely captured by the recording equipment, a melody that meant nothing in any Velthari language, but the rhythm was slow and gentle and repetitive in the way that all lullabies across all species were slow and gentle and repetitive, because the mathematics of comfort were older than civilization. And her child's crest was blue. Not the blue of fear or the blue of cold or the blue of resignation, but the deep steady blue of safety, the color that Velthari young only displayed in the presence of a bonded guardian, a caretaker who had been accepted at the deepest biological level as protector and family. Her child had bonded with the human. "This is a deception," said her senior advisor, a scarred old warrior named Kethrin whose crest displayed the hard amber of suspicion. "The humans are using the child as a tool, perhaps as leverage for negotiations, perhaps as bait for a trap. "Look at the child's crest," Selvin said quietly. "Matriarch, the bonding response can be triggered by simple proximity, and—" "I said look at the child's crest, Catherine." He looked, and he fell silent, because they both knew that the specific shade of blue displayed by a thermally bonded Velthari child could not be faked or forced or manipulated, and it meant one thing and one thing only: that the child felt safe in a way that went beyond thought, beyond instinct, down into the very chemistry of its cells. "The human could have walked past," Selvin said, and her voice was strange, stripped of the commanding tone she usually wore like armor. "He was wounded and alone and without supplies, and stopping to dig through rubble for an enemy child was a decision that reduced his chances of survival significantly. My analysts confirm this, and yet he stopped." "Humans are irrational," Catherine said. "No," Selvin said. "Humans are something else, and I do not yet have a word for what it is." She dispatched more observers, and over the next 2 days she received continuous reports as the human, whose name her intelligence division had now determined was Callum Voss, rank of sergeant, specialty of combat medicine, made his way toward a Terran field hospital in the company of other human soldiers who clearly disapproved of his burden. She watched him treat a wounded human soldier while her child sat against his chest and observed with curious eyes, and she watched the human speak to her child in a soft voice while mixing food, and she watched him check the child's hydration levels with a competence that surprised her because he was applying xenobiological knowledge with a gentleness that suggested he saw the child not as a specimen but as a patient, not as an enemy but as a person. The message from her lead observer came on the 5th day, and it was accompanied by a recording that Selvin would keep for the rest of her life. A Terran air raid had struck near the field hospital, a mistake, apparently friendly fire from a confused Terran bomber wing, and in the chaos of the explosion, the recording showed Callum Voss throw himself over her child, covering the small body completely with his own, curling around it like a shell around a seed, and the blast wave hit him and threw debris across his back, and he did not move, did not flinch, did not shift his weight away from the child, even as blood began to seep through his uniform from fresh wounds. When the dust settled, he uncurled slowly and checked the child first, not himself, not his injuries, the child first, and his hands moved across its small body with the practiced efficiency of a medic and the desperate tenderness of a parent. And only when he was satisfied that the child was unharmed did he slump back against the wall and close his eyes and breathe. The observer's report reached Selvin with a single added line at the bottom, written in the personal notation of a warrior who had spent 15 years studying humans and learning to hate them. "The human would die for your offspring, matriarch. This is not deception, his body proves it, and I confess that I do not understand what I am seeing." Selvin sat with this for a long time, and her crest moved through colors that her advisors could not read. And finally she stood from her throne for the first time in 7 cycles and walked to the communication array at the center of the command chamber. "Open a channel," she said. "To our fleet command?" Catherine asked. "No," Selvin said, and every advisor in the room went still. "To Terran High Command, unencrypted. On all frequencies. Matriarch, that is." "I know what it is," she said. "I am invoking the old law, the one that was written before our species ever left our home world, the one that exists above war and above hatred, and above every grievance we have ever held against any enemy." Catherine's crest went white with shock. "The claim of debt, matriarch, that has not been invoked in 400 years, and never for an outsider, never for a non-Velthari." "There is a human out there," Selvin said, and her voice carried the weight of a mother who had buried 6 children and had just discovered that a stranger from an enemy species had saved the 7th. "There is a human out there who is bleeding for my child, who is starving for my child, who stood between armed soldiers of his own kind and my child and said, 'You will have to go through me.' And you are telling me that the old law does not apply to him because he does not have a crest." She turned to face her advisor fully, and she was 12 feet of ancient fury and newborn wonder, and her crest blazed with a color that the old texts called the light before change. "Open the channel, Catherine. I am going to get my child, and I am going to get the human who saved it. And when I am done, this war is going to learn that there are forces in this galaxy older and stronger than hatred." The channel opened, and her voice traveled at the speed of light toward every Terran receiver in the sector, and the war held its breath. The ceasefire order came down through Terran military channels like a thunderbolt wrapped in confusion, and every officer who received it read it twice, because the words did not make sense in any context they had been trained to understand. A Velthari matriarch, not just any matriarch but Selvin Korath, the supreme war leader of the Southern Expanse, the being who had personally commanded the destruction of 3 human colony worlds, was requesting a parley, and she was requesting it not for territory, not for prisoner exchange, not for any of the strategic objectives that made sense in the grammar of war, but for one single human soldier, a sergeant named Callum Voss. Terran High Command did not know what to do with this, and in the 12 hours between receiving the communication and making a decision, Callum sat in the field hospital with Pip against his chest, and Major Lena Ortiz sat across from him and stared at him with an expression that fell somewhere between awe and exasperation. "Do you understand what is happening?" she said. "Not really," Callum said, which was honest. "The most powerful Velthari military leader in this hemisphere has just broken every rule of engagement to ask for you by name, and you are sitting there feeding nutrient paste to her child like it is a Tuesday." "It is a Tuesday," Callum said. "Callum, I do not know what she wants, Lena. I do not know why she is asking for me. I do not know what happens next, and the only thing I know for certain is that Pip needs to eat every 4 hours or the orange flickering starts, and I do not like the orange flickering." Ortiz rubbed her face with both hands and said, "Command is going to agree to the parley. They have to, because refusing a matriarch's formal request would be a diplomatic disaster, and also because half the intelligence division is beside themselves with curiosity. But they want you to understand that this could be a trap." "It is not a trap," Callum said. "How can you possibly know that?" He looked down at Pip, whose crest was glowing the soft blue of absolute contentment, and said, "Because she could have sent warriors to take the child back by force at any time in the past week, and she did not. She watched instead, which means she was trying to understand, and people who are trying to understand do not set traps." Ortiz had no answer to this, and 6 hours later a Terran transport carried Callum and Pip to a blast crater in the neutral zone between the 2 armies, and it was the most surreal journey of his life, which was saying something for a man who had spent the past week carrying an alien baby through a war zone. The neutral zone had been chosen with mathematical precision, a point equidistant from both front lines, and the blast crater that served as the meeting ground was wide and shallow, and surrounded by scorched earth that offered no cover, which meant that both sides could watch and both sides could see that no treachery was taking place. Callum stood in the center of the crater with Pip in his arms, and behind him stood a wall of Terran soldiers, 300 strong, bristling with weapons, their faces hard and unreadable, and among them were generals and diplomats and intelligence officers who had come to witness something that none of their training had prepared them for. Across the crater, the Velthari assembled, and even after 6 years of fighting them, Callum was not prepared for the sight of a full matriarchal honor guard in formal array, 200 warriors in ceremonial armor that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns, their crests synchronized in a slow pulse of deep gold that signified sacred occasion. And then she came. Matriarch Selvin Korath walked through the ranks of her warriors, and every step she took sent a tremor through the ground that Callum could feel in his bones, and she was larger than any Velthari he had ever seen, Not just tall but massive, armored in living chitin that had been growing and hardening for over a century, scarred and ancient and terrible and magnificent. Her crest blazed with colors that Callum had never seen a Velthari display, colors that shifted and rippled like an aurora trapped in living tissue, and even the Velthari soldiers behind her stared, because this was the matriarchal display of full authority, a visual declaration that the being before you spoke with the weight of an entire civilization. She crossed the crater floor in 7 strides that covered ground faster than Callum expected, and then she stopped, and she was standing before him, and the shadow she cast covered him entirely. Callum looked up at her, and his neck ached from the angle, and he was suddenly and viscerally aware that he was a small wounded human holding this being's child in a place surrounded by enough weapons to level a city, and that the entire situation balanced on a knife edge thinner than anything he had ever stood on. But Pip's crest was blue, steady, calm, peaceful blue, and Pip was looking up at its mother with the first crest color Callum had never seen before, a shimmering ripple of gold and blue mixed together that seemed to say, "The two people I trust most in the universe are in the same place." Selvin looked down at her child, and her crest, that enormous, ancient, battle-scarred crest that had commanded fleets and ordered the burning of worlds, shifted to a color so soft and so warm that it made several of the Velthari warriors look away as if they had witnessed something too private to observe. Then she looked at Callum, and her eyes, 4 of them, deep amber and old beyond human comprehension, studied him with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. She spoke, and the translator device attached to her ceremonial armor carried her words in Terran Standard, and her voice was deep enough to vibrate in Callum's chest cavity, and every word she said would be recorded and analyzed and debated for decades to come. "I am Selvin Korath, matriarch of the Southern Expanse, mother of 7 who became mother of 1 through the fire of this war, and I stand here not as a commander of armies, but as a mother who was given back her child by the hands of an enemy." She paused, and the silence was so complete that Callum could hear the heartbeat of the soldier standing nearest to him. "Among our kind, there is a law that is older than our civilization, older than our first cities, older than the memory of our earliest songs. It is the law that governs the debt of life owed when a stranger protects the young of another, and it has been invoked only 11 times in the recorded history of our species, and never, never, for one who is not Velthari." Her crest shifted again, and this time the color was something Callum's eyes could barely process, a deep, radiant pulse that seemed to carry weight and meaning beyond the visual spectrum. "Today I invoke it for the 12th time, and I invoke it for this human." She raised one massive hand, and the gesture silenced both armies. "I claim this human, he is mine, he is Hive, and from this moment forward no Velthari hand shall ever be raised against him, no Velthari world shall ever be closed to him. His enemies are my enemies, his blood is under the protection of the Korath matriarchy, and this claim shall stand from now until the stars themselves burn cold and the last song is sung." The words landed like stones, dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction, through the Terran ranks where generals exchanged glances of shock, through the Velthari ranks where warriors stared in disbelief at the sight of their matriarch claiming an alien as family, through the communication channels that were broadcasting this moment to ships in orbit and command centers light years away. Callum stood there holding Pip, and he felt the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like gravity itself had increased, and he did not have a speech prepared because he had not known this was going to happen, and he did not have the words to match the ancient ritual she had just performed. So he said the only true thing he had. "I just did not want the kid to die alone." Selvin's crest shifted to the color she had shown when looking at her child, that impossibly soft warmth that no human had ever been shown before, and she said, quietly, in a voice that the translators barely carried, "And that is why you are worthy." Pip reached out from Callum's arms toward its mother, small hands stretching across the gap between human and Velthari, and Selvin lowered her great hand, and the child gripped one of her fingers. And for a moment the three of them were connected, Callum holding Pip, Pip holding its mother. And it was such a simple image, so small against the backdrop of war and armies and ancient law, and yet it cracked something open in the hearts of everyone who saw it. Selvin gently took the child from Callum's arms, and Pip's crest shimmered gold and blue, that beautiful mixed color of dual trust, and the matriarch cradled her last-born against her armored chest with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a being that size. But she did not step back. She remained standing beside Callum, facing the Terran delegation, her child in her arms and the human who had saved it at her side. And the message was clear to everyone who watched, clear to the generals and the diplomats and the soldiers and the observers, and the cameras broadcasting to two civilizations that had been destroying each other for 11 years. The human stays with us. Callum looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and neither of them spoke, because some agreements are made in silence, in the space between two beings who have both lost too much and found something they did not expect in the wreckage. Behind them, the sun of Vareth IV broke through the smoke for the first time in months, and the light caught Pip's crest and turned it into a small beacon of blue fire. And somewhere in the Terran ranks the young private with the dead sister on Marin III lowered his rifle and wiped his eyes and did not care who saw him do it. The war was not over. Wars do not end in single moments no matter how powerful, but something had shifted in the foundations of it, something that could not be unshifted, because both species had just witnessed proof that mercy could survive in the darkest place in the galaxy. And it had come not from a general or a diplomat or a weapon of terrible power. It had come from a medic who shared his last water with a child that was not his own. The galaxy did not know what to do with Callum Voss, and so it did what galaxies always do with things they cannot categorize. It argued about him endlessly while he quietly went about the business of living a life that no one had prepared him for. The claiming of Callum Voss, as historians would come to call it, sent shockwaves through both civilizations with a force that rivaled any weapon ever deployed in the war, because weapons destroyed things and destruction was simple and understandable. But what happened in that blast crater on Vareth IV was something far more dangerous. It was a new idea, and new ideas could not be shot down or bombed or burned. Within days, the recording spread across every human and Velthari communication network, and within weeks every sentient being in the known galaxy had seen the image of a battered human medic, standing in the shadow of a 12-foot alien matriarch, holding her child, and saying 7 words that landed harder than any bomb. "I just did not want the kid to die alone." Callum moved into the Koreth Hive Carrier Undying Song, not because he had no choice but because he had made a promise, not in words, but in the language of thermal bonds and blue crests and sleepless nights spent feeding a child that was not his species, and yet was somehow, impossibly, his. And he was not the kind of man who walked away from promises. They gave him quarters adapted for his biology, a small section of the hive that had been modified with human-standard atmosphere and gravity and lighting, and it was strange and beautiful and deeply uncomfortable. And Callum complained about all of it loudly and frequently, which the Velthari found completely baffling, because in their culture complaints were reserved for formal grievance proceedings, and not for expressing opinions about the temperature of one's sleeping chamber. The nutrient paste tastes like someone dissolved a boot in acid and then apologized to the acid, he told Selvin during one of their first formal meetings after the claiming. The translator struggled with the metaphor, and Selvin's advisors exchanged alarmed glances, but the matriarch herself made a sound that her attendants had never heard her make before, a low, rumbling vibration that shook the furniture in the room, and it took Callum several seconds to realize she was laughing. It was, as far as anyone could determine, the first time a human had made a Velthari matriarch laugh in the history of either species. Pip grew quickly, as Velthari young did, and within months the child had doubled in size and begun to develop the harder chitin plating that would eventually cover its body. But its crest still glowed blue whenever Callum was near, and it still pressed itself against his heartbeat when it was frightened, and it still chirped that small pip-pip-pip sound that it had outgrown biologically but continued to make whenever it saw him, as if the sound was no longer a reflex but a choice, a name, a way of saying, "I know you and you are mine." Callum taught Pip human songs, starting with the lullabies he had sung in the wasteland, and expanding gradually to folk songs and camp songs, and one truly terrible drinking song that he had learned from a corporal on his first deployment. And Pip absorbed them all with the voracious appetite that Velthari young had for sound and pattern. And within 6 months, the child was singing them back to him in a voice that was not human and would never be human, but carried the melodies with a purity that made Callum's chest ache in ways he could not explain. He argued with the Velthari elders constantly, not because he was trying to change them, but because he was Callum Voss and arguing was how he processed the world. And the arguments were fierce and genuine, and covered everything from military ethics to food preparation to whether or not the Velthari concept of territorial honor was distinguishable from plain stubbornness. Most of the elders found him infuriating, and several filed formal complaints through channels that had never been designed to process grievances about a human. And one particularly ancient elder named Vorquin told Selvin that the claiming had been a mistake, and that the human was a disruptive influence on hive harmony. Selvin listened patiently and then said, "He is the most disruptive influence this hive has ever experienced, and that is precisely why he is valuable. He makes us think in directions we have never thought before, and a species that stops thinking in new directions is a species that has already begun to die." Vorquin had no response to this, and Callum was never told about the conversation, though he would have been deeply amused by it. The peace talks began 4 months after the claiming, held on a neutral station in deep space, and they were exactly as difficult and painful and maddening as everyone expected them to be, because 11 years of war had built walls of grief and anger and mistrust that no single act of mercy could tear down overnight. But Callum sat in the room. He sat at a table between human diplomats and Velthari negotiators, and he did not speak often because diplomacy was not his skill, but his presence changed the shape of every conversation, because every time a Terran general began to speak about the Velthari as if they were monsters, he was looking at a man who had carried one of their children through fire, and every time a Velthari commander began to speak about humans as if they were savages, they were looking at a being who had been granted the most sacred honor their civilization could bestow. He was a living contradiction to every story both sides had told themselves about the other. And contradictions are the most powerful weapons against hatred, because hatred requires simplicity, and Callum's existence made simplicity impossible. The talk stalled and restarted and stalled again, and there were moments when both sides came close to walking away and returning to the killing. But each time that happened, someone would look at Callum or remember the recordings or think about the image of a wounded man singing lullabies to a child that was not his kind, and something would soften just enough to allow the next sentence to be spoken. It took 2 years for the Treaty of Verath to be signed, and it was imperfect and flawed and full of compromises that neither side was happy with, which meant, as Callum observed, that it was probably fair. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy talked, and among the older species who had been observing humanity since its first fumbling steps into space, the reaction was not what anyone expected. The Onvari, a species so ancient that they had watched stars being born, convened a rare assembly to discuss the implications of what had happened on Verath 4, and the speaker of their assembly, a being older than some civilizations, addressed the gathered representatives of 40 spacefaring species and said words that would be quoted for centuries. We have watched 10,000 species wage war across the ages, and we have seen courage and cruelty and brilliance and savagery in measures that defy counting. But in all our long observation, we have found only one species that consistently displays the trait that we consider the most dangerous force in the universe. The humans can love what they were taught to hate. They can choose mercy when it serves no evolutionary purpose. They can look at the face of their enemy's child and see not a threat but a person. And that is not weakness. That is the most terrifying power in the galaxy, because it means that no amount of war or propaganda or conditioning can fully overwrite the compassion in their biology. They will always find their way back to it. Years passed, and the scars of the war healed slowly the way all deep scars do, not by disappearing but by becoming part of the landscape, part of the story that both species told about who they were and who they wanted to become. Callum grew older in the way that humans do, which was fast and visible and startling to the Velthari who measured their lives in centuries, and his hair turned gray and his movements slowed. But his voice never lost the steadiness that had calmed a dying child in the ruins of a nursery, and his arguments with the elders never lost their fire, and his terrible singing never improved even slightly, which Pip told him regularly and with great affection. On a quiet evening many years after the war, Callum sat in a garden aboard the Hive carrier Undying Song, a space that had been grown specifically for him, filled with plants from Earth and Velthari bioluminescent flora that glowed softly in the darkness like living starlight, and beside him sat Pip. Pip was no longer small. The child had grown into a young adult Velthari, tall and strong, with chitin that shimmered with the deep iridescent patterns of the Koreth bloodline, and a crest that could display more colors than most Velthari twice its age. But when Pip sat beside Callum, the crest always returned to blue, that first and deepest color, the color of safety and home and the heartbeat of a man who had knelt in the rubble when he could have walked away. They watched the stars together through the transparent hull of the garden dome, and the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence can only be between two beings who have known each other since one of them was small enough to fit in the other's arms. "Father Guardian," Pip said, in accented but fluent Terran standard that still carried the harmonic undertones of Velthari vocal structure, "I have a question I have wanted to ask you for a very long time." "Then ask it," Callum said. "Why did you save me? You did not know me. I was not your species, not your kind, not your responsibility in any way that your people or mine would have recognized. And you had every reason to leave me, every justification that war provides for looking away from suffering that belongs to the enemy, and yet you did not leave." Callum was quiet for a long time, and the garden glowed around them, and the stars turned slowly beyond the dome, and when he spoke his voice was rough with age but steady in the way it had always been steady, in the way that had calmed a child and faced down soldiers and changed the course of a war. "Because someone had to prove that we are better than our worst days," he said, "and I figured might as well be me." Pip's crest glowed blue, deeper and steadier than it had ever glowed, the blue of absolute trust and unshakable love, and the young Velthari leaned against the old human and listened to his heartbeat, the same heartbeat that had been the first safe sound in a universe of fire and rubble, and for a while neither of them needed to say anything more. Across the garden, standing in the shadow of a doorway carved from living wood, matriarch Selvin Koreth watched them, her child and her human, the two beings who had rewritten the laws of her civilization and the future of her species. And her crest displayed a color that her attendants had never catalogued and would never fully understand. It was the color of a mother who had lost everything and found, in the most impossible place, something she had never thought to look for. And for the first time in the recorded history of the Velthari, a matriarch smiled. Not the diplomatic expression that matriarchs sometimes displayed for political purposes, not the baring of teeth that signified dominance, but a real and genuine curving of ancient features that carried in it the weight of a truth that both species were only beginning to understand. That the bridge between worlds is not built from treaties or technology or power, but from the small and stubborn decision of one person to kneel in the rubble and say to a child that is not their own, "It is all right, I have got you." And across the galaxy, in classrooms and council chambers and nurseries on 100 worlds, they told the story of the human who carried the enemy's child, and the mother who claimed him, and the war that ended not with a weapon but with a lullaby. And every time the story was told, it planted the same seed in the same soil. The seed that said mercy is not weakness. The seed that said love is not foolishness. The seed that said the measure of a species is not how it treats its allies, but how it treats the most helpless child of its most hated enemy. And humanity, chaotic, stubborn, short-lived, impossible humanity, had passed that test in the dark, on a ruined world with no one watching, for no reward, simply because a tired medic looked at a crying child and could not walk away. That was the human story, and it was the most dangerous story in the galaxy. Because it was true,